One of my passion projects over the last 4 years has been pulling together the evidence that I think points to the Gospel of Matthew being written in Hebrew. This evidence ranges from the testimony of the early church, wordplays and puns and alliteration and poetry in the Hebrew text, and text-critical analysis that points to the Hebrew edition I draw from being the source of the existing Greek edition. I've transcribed the manuscript that I believe best represents the Hebrew version of Matthew behind the Greek text. Then I've added marginal notes that I believe improve that Hebrew text to be even more in line with the original text. I'm not a textual critic, and I don't play one on television, so I'm entirely open to a better trained textual critic creating a better Hebrew text. But for now I really think that what I offer is as good as the available Greek texts of Matthew. However, there is a common complaint that those with a particular creedal bent will raise as though it is an automatic win against the evidence I raise. The idea of a Hebrew Matthew violates the doctrine of scriptural preservation. I disagree. The doctrine of preservation is at the root of a lot of debates in textual studies. For example, conversations about whether the long ending of Mark or the story of the woman caught in adultery or the Comma Johanneum come around to the doctrine of preservation eventually. In each of these cases, they were once included in every edition of the Bible, and now there are disputes about whether or not they belong there. I'm going to leave the first two to one side for the purpose of this conversation, but the Comma Johanneum is an interesting case where we can document how it evolved in the Latin tradition and was only absorbed back into the original Greek language just as the manuscript tradition was giving way to the printing tradition. This concerns some people. How could nearly 300 years of printed Greek New Testaments be wrong? Beyond that, even before the collation of manuscripts into printed editions, the Latin Vulgate manuscripts that dominated Western Europe and shaped our theologians included that text for 1,000 years before that. King James and Textus Receptus advocates argue that we can't have been so wrong, citing the doctrine of preservation as their reason to believe this. This can be seen in a debate between James Snap and two Textus Receptus proponents, Mike Holner and Mike Ferrando. I tend to approach the world from a different angle than most confessional Christians. My only allegiance is to the truth. As such, I hold no commitment to any doctrine except so far as it can be demonstrated to be true. That's why I've never really concerned myself with the question whether Hebrew Matthew and the doctrine of preservation are compatible. If they're in conflict, that just proves that the doctrine of preservation is wrong, and I'll leave those who follow untrue traditions to clean up that mess. I don't like to approach people from that angle, though. If the doctrine of preservation were proven wrong by Hebrew Matthew, there are a lot of people that have put a lot of stock into that position, and they would be hurt. I don't want them to be hurt. I want them to thrive. So with that in mind, I decided to actually examine the question. Does Hebrew Matthew actually conflict with the doctrine of preservation? I started this post from a very different place, and I had to rewrite it. When I started, my thesis was going to be that Hebrew Matthew contradicts certain understandings of the doctrine of preservation, that nuanced and modern takes on preservation would have no problem with it, but older and more conservative approaches would. As I looked into it, I found that this wasn't quite as true as I originally thought. Hebrew Matthew contradicts a very small subset of very precise interpretations of the doctrine of preservation. Most doctrines of preservation, ranging from progressive to very conservative, won't have a problem with it. It's only when the doctrine includes explicit language about the language of preservation, the people who must have had access to the original text, or both, that the doctrine contradicts Hebrew Matthew. I'll give some examples of ways the doctrine might be phrased that would conflict with Hebrew Matthew. If someone were to say as their understanding of the doctrine of preservation, the inspired texts are preserved in their original languages, which is only Hebrew and Aramaic for the Old Testament and only Greek for the New Testament, this would clearly conflict with Hebrew Matthew. Or if someone were to say their doctrine of preservation as, the text of the Bible is that which was used by the Reformers during the time of the Reformation, that would almost certainly go against Hebrew Matthew. However, I'm not convinced that either languages nor people are magical, or that God was under any particular obligation to ensure that any specific set of people had any kind of special access to the original text, or that any specific distribution of languages was followed. For those things, I'm going to follow the evidence rather than the doctrine. However, when someone considers a doctrine of preservation without such explicit statements about languages, particular editions, people, or places, all the other elements of a doctrine of preservation are completely compatible with Hebrew Matthew. I can use the Comma Johanneum and a Textus Receptus preferred doctrine of presentation as an example to illustrate why this is the case. I'm not a TR guy. I'm a majority text guy. However, a statement of doctrine for the doctrine of preservation that's preferential towards the majority text position will be even easier to reconcile with Hebrew Matthew, and a modern/critical/Alexandrian compatible statement will be even easier to reconcile than that. Initially, I thought that I would need a statement that was compatible with at least the majority text position, but in trying to prove that Hebrew Matthew would not be compatible with the TR position, I ended up discovering that it was. The statement I will use is, the text of the Bible is preserved in a notable, systematic way that skilled Christian theologians can discover a text which is compatible with the original in the language they pursue truth in all times and places after it was written, and evaluate the text available in the original languages to find the original text. This isn't an actual formulation, but borrows from a few different sources, and is constructed to be more conservative than most formations someone will actually encounter. Such a person would conclude, against the evidence provided by text critics, that the Comma Johanneum was original simply because all of the text commonly available in Western Europe during the 17th century included the CJ. They would not be bothered by the idea that there was almost no text available in the West that was written in Greek, though. They would note that the text between the Vulgate and the Greek original was mostly compatible. A Latin reader in the West was reading mostly the same text as a Greek reader in the East, just in another language. This person would not need any particular edition of the Textus Receptus to be exactly perfect. They could see the evidence laid out by Mark Ward that there are multiple, incompatible editions of the TR and conclude that any of them are close enough for most people. The original text can be worked out by a skilled theologian from the existing manuscripts and editions, they would say, but this doesn't by their standard require that the text be laid out in one perfect edition. Every single manuscript out there has a few unique readings, but by considering them all and the scope of Christian thought on the subject, they believe that the original text can be reached. These same techniques and considerations could be applied to the Hebrew Matthew. The Matthew of the Vulgate is mostly compatible with Hebrew, and the Matthew of the Textus Receptus or majority text is likewise mostly compatible with Hebrew Matthew. There are a few unique readings in any single manuscript, but if someone compares the Paris manuscript to the British Harley manuscript, and includes the marginal notes from the edition of Munster's text printed by Johannes Quinqueborius, they could reconstruct a unified text. They had the same level of compatibility as any other Textus Receptus edition of Matthew. And a majority text proponent would have it even easier. They would note that the majority of New Testament manuscripts are Latin, and would not be bothered by that when reconstructing a Greek text for the other books. That there are more Greek manuscripts for Matthew than Hebrew should similarly pose no problem. They would still compare the Hebrew text that's available, but if they're the type to consider commentaries in their textual analysis, they'll incorporate readings that George Howard noted from Even Bowen and other Jewish commentaries. A critical text examination would have it even easier. They would still bring in the witness of ancient Greek manuscripts to complete their analysis of Hebrew Matthew, the same way they do to reconstruct Hebrew texts in the Old Testament like Deuteronomy 32 verse 8. With all of this in mind, I would like to take a moment to consider what people seem to mean when they say that Hebrew Matthew contradicts the doctrine of preservation, and why these ideas don't work. One thing that people seem to mean when they say that the doctrine of preservation is incompatible with Hebrew Matthew is simply that they are unaware of a text of Matthew in Hebrew that has a legitimate claim to descend from a text in the 1st century. The only thing I can say to this is, I do. I am aware of a family that I believe descends from the early church with evidence that the Greek edition of Matthew derives from that Hebrew version, not the other way around. Another thing that some mean by preservation of Scripture is that all the manuscripts in this family are from the Middle Ages. They expect a text to have representation in the first millennium of the Church. In that case, Nehemiah and Esther have not been preserved in Hebrew either. Before the discovery of the scrolls at Qumran, vanishingly little of the Old Testament had a full book preserved that was older than 1,000 years. For those who cling to the hope that we will discover more Hebrew texts of the Old Testament buried in the desert or locked away in a library backroom that hasn't been explored in multiple centuries, the same hope could be extended to Hebrew Matthew. It was only as recently as 2020 that the Harley manuscript of Hebrew Matthew was examined by Joseph Gebhardt Klein. Who is to say what manuscripts of Hebrew Matthew are out there and haven't been examined simply because we aren't looking for them? Another thing that some people seem to mean by this is that mainstream textual criticism hasn't ever chosen to do a translation into English from a Hebrew source. I again say that I do not think that any group of people or language has any special status before God in regard to receiving His written word. There was a time when all the translations into English were taken from the Vulgate. That doesn't mean that the Greek and Hebrew lost their status as original or inspired. Other people simply mean that they have a preferred translation or original language edition of the New Testament, and since Hebrew Matthew isn't in it, they can't see it as preserved. This is where epistemic humility comes in. Maybe, in the case of Matthew, you've simply chosen incorrectly. That doesn't mean it's not preserved. It means that you made a mistake. I've been there and I know it hurts. But if that's the case, you can hold my hand and we will get through it together. Likewise, if you can show me that I've made a mistake, I'll likely need some hand-holding. This isn't a competition. It's seeking the truth. Other people use the idea that something violates the doctrine of preservation as a means to shut down conversations that make them uncomfortable. For these, doctrine is a shield they hide behind when the facts are too hard to face. I understand. Sometimes, the truth hurts. Sometimes, learning something new can lead to abandoning a belief that's cherished and important, that has consumed a lot of time and energy and money, or that has broken or built relationships that are more important than knowing the truth. I agree. Those cherished beliefs and the time or money and relationships that are intertwined with them are more important than which language Matthew was written in. That doesn't make you right. It makes you vulnerable. I won't fight you, because I recognize that you need care and guidance more than you need to seek the truth. Please, return the favor. Don't put me in the place of having to choose between pursuing the truth and protecting your fragile heart. I don't always have the moment-to-moment self-awareness to recognize that the true things I'm saying are causing damage until the damage is done. In a minority of cases, I have found that there are some who use the idea that something violates a doctrine as a way to control the conversation. They'll say that this violates the doctrine of preservation, or some other doctrine. They aren't always consistent, and then use that to label me a heretic and outside the reach of orthodoxy. They are aggressive and make their attacks personal. They refuse to explain how or why this violates the doctrine they've chosen, and refuse to examine the evidence that the scriptures they do hold to don't hold up to the imaginary standard that they create to refute me. These people seem to me to be more interested in control than truth. I find them immensely frustrating. Often they are pastors or scholars, and their proof that they're right is the size of their congregation or the degree they have earned. I am a nobody from nowhere, and I'll admit it. But I'm not trying to start a congregation. I'm not seeking an advanced degree. I'm only pursuing the truth. The way to convince me is to show me that you put more stock in truth than the size of your congregation or the accolades of a school. If you still think that the doctrine of preservation excludes Hebrew Matthew, why? Do you have a reason that I haven't listed? What is it?